the underlying premise here too is that you need local supply. So lithium is somewhat plentiful. You have to find areas like Thacker Pass. There are others in the U.S. that would make economic sense to tap, and then work through the policy issues there too, and that you're going to have tremendous growth in this industry.
Good day, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara, co-president of Teneo Political Risk Advisory in New York City. So the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow earlier this month was a mixed success at best, but it did serve to yet again remind us that the energy and transportation transformation we are only in the nascent stages of right now presents both the greatest business challenge and the greatest business opportunity, I think, really since the Industrial Revolution. And obviously, the iconic representative product of both of these revolutions and eras is, of course, the car, starting with the internal combustion engine and now, of course, electric vehicles. And Tesla, obviously the standard bearer, with a market cap now exceeding most of the other car companies combined. Indeed, Elon Musk's own personal net worth now exceeds the market cap of ExxonMobil, a company that he effectively is trying to render obsolete. And the Model 3 itself became the best-selling car, not just an electric vehicle, but best-selling car in Europe in the month of September. And even Lucid, a company that will only start making cars and selling at scale next year, its market cap now exceeds that of Ford. So the market is speaking, but of course, to power electric vehicles, you need batteries. And to make batteries, you need, among other things, lithium. And currently, the majority of the world's lithium is mined in Australia and South America, while only 1% is mined in the US. And that's about to change, though, thanks in no small part to my guest today. Jonathan Evans is the CEO and president and a director of Lithium Americas. It's a New York Stock Exchange listed Canadian company which has operations that are starting up in Nevada as well as in Argentina. He's worked in lithium before at FMC and has over 20 years of experience in industry, minerals, and in life sciences. And we're joined today as well by my colleague and frequent collaborator here, Orson Porter. He is a Teneo Senior Managing Director. He heads our DC office and he's leads our government and public affairs practice. He is a veteran of the White House, where he served as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton and was the U.S. Director of Government and Public Affairs for Nike. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today. So, John, let me start with you, and maybe perhaps we can take a step back and do just a bit of a 101 here, because I think if most of the audience is like me, their understanding is that lithium goes into battery goes into the car, and off we go. But I think it's a little bit more complex than that. So maybe we could do a little bit of a 101 here. You know, what is lithium and what is its function? And how does it get from the ground into your Tesla or your iPhone or your laptop?
Great. Well, thanks, Kevin and Orson. It's really great to join you both this morning. So you're right. Lithium is an element. Obviously, it's the lightest metal, has the highest electrochemical potential. So it's really the motive force in a battery. When you have lithium impregnated on the cathode of the battery, when you charge it, it moves to the anode of the battery, and as the battery discharges, the electrons flow through and give you power, and the ions move to the other side of the battery, if you will, until they're exhausted and they can be recharged again. And that's a cycle that can be repeated, of course, over and over, just like when you got to plug your cell phone in. But due to its position on the periodic table and in chemical and electrochemical properties, it's the best chemistry to use. It's been tested heavily, of course. It's in all of our pockets. It's on your laptops. So for the last 30 years or more, it's been ubiquitous. And now that technology has been transferred at larger scale to cars. And really, literally, the same technology used when Tesla first launched their vehicles. They mimicked the same type of batteries you have in your laptop, but basically multiplied it times 4,000 or so. stack that cell in the car, and it's proven technology. It's a basic engineering concept. Always borrow from things that have been proven in the past. So it's the underlying common denominator in all battery technology, at least now, and I think going forward for the next 10 to 20 years, we're likely going to see lithium as the dominant force. We're a pretty innovative species, so perhaps something comes over the horizon, but at least in vehicles, given the safety we expect, just like when you get on an airliner, you don't ask questions. It's the same for cars. So change takes a long time.
And can you talk a little bit about the supply chain process? How from when it gets out of the ground and ultimately into the battery pack.
So there's a multitude of different ways or sources of lithium. You have it from a rock, if you will, which is traditional mining. You have it from a brine, which is a very salty water that has got a lot of lithium content in it that could be separated and concentrated. And you have it from other sources like sedimentary clays, which are basically, in most cases, it's a sediment left over from a volcanic eruption and deposited in a thick layer on the ground over time. Volcanoes are sort of the common denominator for how lithium sort of gets concentrated places. So if you look at where most of the lithium is, it's the highest concentrations. You'll see it on the Pacific Ring of Fire and places where there's been past volcanic type of activity. But the processes differ a little bit. They mostly be involved making sure that you concentrate, because like rare earths, lithium, number one, never occurs in nature by itself because where it is on the periodic table. So you have to find the deposit, concentrate it up enough to a point where you can then extract it out of the underlying ore that it's in, and then you subject it to a purification process and make a chemical at the end. They call it lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide, which is then used in your battery. So it's a multitude of different steps. And you're right, most of it comes from Australia or South America, with a little bit from China and even less from the United States.
And one final sort of tech question on this. Do you think that, is the sort of, when we talk about global transportation, is the car and truck sort of the end of the line here? I mean, I know that these batteries are quite heavy, as an example, so I'm assuming it's not going to be considered an efficient option for aircraft. But what about for shipping, as an example? Would the batteries, given the distances, just need to be too big?
Yeah, potentially. I think it would depend on innovations like you're hearing about solid state batteries, which are batteries that don't have an electrolyte in them, which the electrolyte is the layer between your two electrodes, if you will, and it's flammable. There's been innovations now to remove that and put a ceramic layer in between it and replace the anode with lithium metal, and that doubles, sometimes triples the energy capacity of a battery, makes it a lot smaller. You can put a lot more cells in the same space, and with it to have a lot more stored energy. So hard to say, but the industry continues to innovate. A lot of that innovation is actually in the U.S. If you look at companies like QuantumScape and Solid Power, and there's a whole multitude of other startups in Silicon Valley and in the Boston, Cambridge area. It's exciting to see as the technology is continually innovated.
And so at the top of this call, I mentioned that you are starting up operations in Nevada, and you mentioned how small the current footprint of lithium production is in the United States. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Thacker Pass in Nevada. It's the largest known lithium reserve in the U.S. And what you're planning there is the key attribute of that asset that it's in the U.S., or are there other advantageous aspects to that project?
Well, the geology and the lithium content, really, that's what drew us to that site, and it wasn't something that was necessarily a surprise at first, because the deposit was discovered by Chevron when they were looking for uranium. They didn't find any uranium back 40 years ago, but they found a lot of lithium. At that point, the industry was too small to really worry about it. And over the last 10 years or so, a forerunner of our company and then our company itself really did a lot of research to really understand how that deposit formed and number two, how big and how rich it was in lithium. And we've looked around the world. We haven't found anything which rivals the size of Thacker Pass itself, which what Thacker Pass is actually a huge volcanic caldera. So where the Yellowstone Park is today, that hot spot actually started in Nevada. As the Earth crust moved, it moved to Wyoming over millions of years. So it was a massive volcanic eruption. A lot of ash that was rich in lithium was of course expended. A big lake was formed, like Crater Lake in Oregon, and this very thick layer of sediment at the bottom formed, and over time it uplifted the lake drained, and at the surface and right below now you have this basically sedimentary layer, which is very, very rich in lithium, unlike anything we've seen in the entire world. That's what really brought us to the site. And the plan now that we have, of course, is to put in a completely integrated operation in there. So the supply chains today generally are Australia is the biggest exporter of a lithium concentrate, and then it goes to China. And China does most of the conversion into a usable product for batteries or other industries. And then, of course, it is either used domestically or sold and exported to countries like Japan and Korea or here. It's to basically put that entire supply chain, that footprint, all in one site. So you have the mining piece, you have the all-important purification and chemical conversion piece, which we consider ourselves a chemical company, not a mining company. And actually the final product that's made at the Thacker Pass site can be sold to the battery industry directly, all on a footprint with a much lower carbon footprint than you're going to see today, where product moves thousands of miles over multiple steps.
So Orson, this sounds like a fantastic story. I mean, obviously, one of the things that has been such a key issue through the pandemic, and as the rivalry with China continues to grow, and all of the supply chain issues, is this security of supply in any number of industries has just been a key point. So here, John is talking about security of supply. It's part of the energy transition, which is so critical to our competition with China, number one, but also critical to the objectives of the Biden administration and the
Right.
wider climate transformation and climate change community. And it sounds like it's going to be great for jobs in Nevada and elsewhere as well. But in Washington, D.C., there's always a yeah, but. So what's the but here, and what kind of hurdles are being put up, if any, to the lithium industry in Washington?
Well, first of all, Kevin, thanks for having me on, and it's a pleasure to join John. I want to wish him a belated Happy Veterans Day. I know he served our country, and I have the utmost respect for his service. Another thing I want to point out with John, to answer your question directly, Kevin, is John is really a bit of a trailblazer on this issue, in that I think he, as we look back in the history books, is really going to play a pivotal role in securing the future of this country for the next generation as it relates to clean energy. And the issue in Washington is, as my former boss always told me, is to follow the money, follow the influence, and should know, that in 2020 there were only 300,000 electric vehicles sold compared to nearly 15,000 lightweight vehicles. The number is rising. People are being educated, as John and you mentioned, about lithium being in cell phones that people touch every day, their laptops, digital cameras, et cetera, et cetera. But this is really a new frontier, kind of what we've seen on the social media discussion in DC, which has been a interesting merry-go-round of sorts. So I think, when you really think about the arguments of why we need lithium exploration, one, for clean energy, two, to combat climate change, three, as you rightly pointed out, to stay competitive in global markets, particularly as we expand on the electric vehicle piece. And then most importantly, as you heard the president really champion yesterday, the possibility of growing green jobs. So I think the but is we are just at the start of the first quarter in Washington, D.C. John and his team have done an outstanding job of educating this administration, and behind the scenes, the Secretary of Energy and key members of the White House are very supportive of the discussion and the exploration. But I think you have a lot of members of Congress, in particular, who probably aren't as well as versed on these issues, and it's just a matter of time before, as I mentioned, that 300,000 electric vehicles sold in 2020 become 1 million vehicles 5 years out, and everyone in Congress, as we are having the discussion on the supply chain related to semiconductors, the shortage, everyone in Congress will be talking about well, how do we stay competitive on the battery piece and lithium? And then that's when I think they'll open up the history books and see John way back in 2021 saying, guys and gals, we really need to get ahead of this curve.
And what about what, I know that the environmental movement and climate change advocates and the like, it's not a monolithic block, obviously, and so people are sort of have views across the spectrum. But where does the sort of the mainstream of environmental concern come down on all of this? I mean, do they see this as an essential part of the energy transition, or is there a meaningful is there a meaningful wing of that block that simply doesn't want to dig any holes in the ground anywhere and is kind of against anything that involves, say, mining in this country? And how do they square that circle then?
Well, I think you're always going to have a small percentage that disagrees with just about everything. The sun is up today in DC, and I'm sure there's a small percentage of folks in DC who may say, no, actually, I see a few clouds. So I think, it's all about education, and it's all about, having a thorough discussion. And I think what we're seeing, particularly on this issue, and that's is where I think DC could be, a very powerful piece in the equation, is we really haven't had, and John can speak to this better than I, a national conversation on this issue, where the federal governments and others have used their convening powers to bring the environmental groups and John and others in the field to really talk through those issues. So unfortunately, when you don't have that, the media becomes the only weapon of choice. And then that's when I think you see some of the statements that we've seen in the past that mostly have been misguided, because John and his team and others, and maybe even on the environmental side, we haven't, or they haven't, been able to share their concerns. But I think John has a great story with what they're trying to do, and I'll allow him to speak to it.
Well, and maybe I can interject here and ask you, John. I mean, we just got the DC perspective. What about the Carson City perspective? I mean, you and Orson have both highlighted the green jobs element here, which are typically good paying jobs, and obviously there's a long glide path here. Nevada obviously went through a pretty tough time when Clark County, particularly Las Vegas, had to shut down during the pandemic. So presumably, good jobs are something that would be of interest. But how is the state and local politics looking out in Nevada on this?
No, the state's supportive, very supportive actually, and it's exactly that. I mean, Nevada and the governor understands that, his administration understands that, and the federal representatives from Nevada understand that you have an ability or opportunity actually in Nevada, unlike any other state in the U.S. You already have Tesla and Panasonic, which you said blazed the way, one of the largest gigafactories in the world. You have Redwood Materials, which is JB is a Tesla alumni, and there's other companies that are coalescing around him as well around the recycling. And you have lithium deposits. Ours isn't the only one. And in the state to the south, you have Albemarle operating. You have us. There are other companies that are looking at potential deposits. So you have the entire supply chain from cradle to grave, all in one state. And you can see what's happened in Reno, outside the housing prices going up. You have a Silicon Valley type deal where all of these engineers have come and you go to the hotel in Reno and there's people from Japan. It really adds an element to the economy there for future growth and high paying jobs growth. And the rural communities, the same. Nevada is a natural resources state. When I come to Washington, I grew up in upstate New York, in New England. Our perspective on mining and natural resources, I didn't really have one except for whenever you saw it on TV, it was usually something bad. Where if you go and talk to the Western folks, it's a way of life. You have ranching, you have mining. There's all sorts of industries that are critical to those states. And there's an understanding there too that it's in a critical part of their economy. So it's a different kind of conversation. And as with that too, the states there welcome this type of investment. It leverages the resources that they have. It's a much different view of the world.
So I want to pivot a little bit here to pivot out and look at the bigger ambition, particularly on electric vehicles, because earlier this year, the CEO of General Motors, Mary Barra, announced the phasing out of internal combustion engines for General Motors by 2035. Other car makers are similarly ambitious. But I've seen studies, for instance, that suggest if Tesla alone were to meet its ambition of 20 million electric vehicles per year by 2030, that they alone would require 165% of current global production of lithium, and 90% of current global production of graphite, and over 50% of cobalt, and half of rare earth metals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So tell us about how industry is going to close this supply deficit over time, lithium specifically, but to the extent you can talk about some of the other essential elements here as well. What are you thinking, and can it keep up? Can these industries keep up with the ambitions of the electric vehicle industry and the demands of government on that energy transformation and transportation transformation?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, Tesla, and then I could throw out Ford and SK Innovation. The investments they just announced in the U.S., 130 gigawatt hours. That's about 100,000 tons of lithium. That's a quarter of the world's supply today. So all of these stacked up. I mean, the U.S. has a pretty high level of demand coming in the next 4 to 10 years, which OEMs are worried and of course want local development, local supply chains for lots of reasons, to include climate change. And it's the underlying premise here too is that you need local supply. So lithium is somewhat plentiful. You have to find areas like Thacker Pass. There are others in the U.S. that would make economic sense to tap, and then work through the policy issues there too. And that you're going to have tremendous growth in this industry. I think the key to lithium and some of the other minerals or metals in this space too, and that sometimes often forgotten, is we talk about recycling. Sometimes people say it's a solution. Well, we'll just recycle now and we'll be fine. But you have to build it first in order to recycle something. To support the growth, you actually have to put the original batteries out. That's going to require virgin material, if you will. And battery life is usually 10 years. So as these batteries start to come out of service in the next 10 years, you're going to start having enough where it makes sense, where it's going to start to meaningfully contribute to the supply as well. Probably 10, 15 years from now, you'll have 10, 15, maybe 20% of the lithium, nickel, other elements that actually can be supplied through recycling. So this isn't an endless cycle of like oil and gas where I'm just scouring the world, drilling holes. eventually, like the lead acid battery, we don't talk about lead mines opening around the world. This loop will be closed, or at least the gap will be a lot smaller. That's going to take probably 30 or 40 years, but that's where we're heading here, where you will have a circular supply chain, if you will, because you can recycle. In the meantime, though, we have to quickly start. The industry is actually underlying all this too is innovation. So we have cobalt, nickel, lithium. People are looking now to simplify the mixture and go to just lithium, nickel, and manganese. Some manufacturers like Tesla and CATL in China are just lithium, iron, and phosphate. So they're trying to simplify the recipe as opposed to a complicated one. Maybe others that have materials that are more readily available and also easier to manage. So you don't have to scour the world where some minerals like cobalt right now, the most economic deposits are in the DRC. And that's not a great place to source material. It would cause a problem for lots of people. And you have a lot of competition from other governments that are well ahead of us on this that really wouldn't mind actually tapping resources in some locations like that. We can't and shouldn't do that as Western or as U.S. Market.
And Kevin, if I may,
yeah, go ahead, Orson.
add on to that, the thing that I think, I mentioned earlier, the power of the government to be a convener. I have to give credit where credit is due, even though my grandmother once said, taking too much credit will put you in debt. But the Biden team is taking a lot of credit for this infrastructure bill and hopefully the passage of their Build Back Better plan. And I think they should be commended on finding ways to make the decision easier to have the problem you're discussing in the future by, turning all vehicles in the federal government into electric vehicles, putting a charging system throughout the interstate framework, and then most importantly, because electric vehicles are not cheap, finding strategic tax credits to make them a little bit more competitive in the market. So I think, as you're seeing with this whole supply chain discussion, it all happened probably because of COVID. On demand, people were at home and decided to hit the click button of yes, I'll buy that, and that has not happened as of yet. Particularly on the electric vehicle side, definitely on the cell phone piece, that's a different discussion. But I think, as I mentioned, you have to give this administration some credit here for setting up the dilemma of a problem by making certain that the EV infrastructure is ready when people finally click the button to say, yes, I'll buy that car.
I agree.
So Orson, let's unpack that just a little bit. I mean, it's been said that there are three ways really for countries to exert influence in the energy transition. One is to be leader in renewables. Two is to control the raw materials like lithium and cobalt and others that are necessary for the transition. And third is to have a technological edge. Obviously, renewables are potentially dispersed around the world or anywhere where there's wind and sun and water and the like. But you cannot have this energy transition conversation and electric vehicle conversation and not talk about China, obviously. And it seems like China's got a big competitive edge here at the moment. Not only do they produce half of all electric vehicles, but they've got 90% of the capacity to process raw lithium, 70% of cobalt, 40% of nickel. The list goes on. Near total control of the processing of manganese and graphite, and so they control a lot of this supply chain. You can't have an electric vehicle in this country without China's participation in some way. And John talked about the closing of that supply chain loop, and in fact, almost being able to have the entire operation start to finish in Nevada. But there was only $7 billion for the supply chain for batteries in the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. It's a drop in the bucket. What's going on in Washington? Obviously, industrial policy is a key word or key term in China. But how do we ensure and how do we make sure that there's an organized effort to compete on this front, as opposed to hoping that each of these private sector elements of that supply chain, from getting the stuff out of the ground to car rolling out of the showroom, is efficiently achieved?
I'll take the first half of that. Maybe John can follow up. I think, I had the honor of touring GM a while ago and getting a quick view of the Hummer. Make no mistake, it wasn't by accident that the president decided to tour that facility. And I'm sure you've seen the video of him burning rubber and really letting America know that it was one hell of a vehicle and might be as fast as his Corvette. So to answer your question, I think it's the innovation and it's cars like the Hummer that will keep us ahead of the game, because no one can't capture the imagination of America, but particularly global markets like the American auto industry can. And as they continue to roll out innovative, distinctive vehicles such as the Hummer, I think that conversation could be mute, but it all comes down to what goes into the Hummer, which is a tough discussion item that maybe John's better to respond to.
Yeah, look,
John, what's your take on this?
We have all the ingredients, literally, and I always like to include Canada here because when you look at resources, mineral resources, graphite and others, between the two countries, and that's the automotive manufacturers, we have it all here. The tech, the materials, the processing capability. Beyond that, from a government standpoint, very interesting. So they have an industrial policy, which is great. I commend the Biden administration with what we have here. Mimics what Japan, Korea, and China has been operating under, but this is very specific and targeted. But with that, the auto industry is moving. They've hit the accelerator already. This transition is happening. So this isn't like the government pushing towards emission standards or whatever. The money's flowing. The factories are going in the ground. This is billions and billions of dollars. So the government can help here, whether it's different. They don't have to pay for all this, actually. Private money is coming into this. It started with the OEMs, but even in our sector, it's really how do you do this in a sustainable way and quickly versus how do we get as taxpayers to pay for all this stuff? This space is one that people want to invest in for more than just returns. It's the right thing to do. And the automotive companies they're changing right in front of us. Their commitments not to have any more internal combustion engines, in 2035, the whole fleet electric. And with that, those supply chains, and it was echoed, I was on a call with GM the other day on the Atlantic Council, they want to have their supply chains here locally, as they do today for internal combustion engines. It's basically between US, actually Canada and Mexico included, everything. All the fabrication of the parts, batteries, the raw materials, it's all done basically in North America for the most part. And that's the same type of supply chain that they're envisioning here. Again, we have all the elements. I think the government, it's really sitting down and understanding, to Orson's point, education, number one. And number two, I think it's where are the barriers right now where we can come up with win-win solutions, but also don't lose time. Because there are countries, you're right, that, look, China, for lots of reasons, moved in here. Number one was air pollution was terrible there. So this actually helps fix a huge problem for them. But also it's a huge lead based on, as we started the conversation, well-known technology that we trust, which could completely and will completely change the automotive industry, which the U.S. and Europe basically started and have dominated for decades, for 100 years, and you're seeing a complete flip. And it would be a shame to lose those roles where you're importing batteries and dropping them into car frames, and you lose all the value add. And that's what can happen in the U.S. and Europe both if we don't understand what's missing here, and as a government can help from a policy standpoint, help ensure that there's no barriers and we don't debate forever.
Yeah, let me ask you something about what you just said there, because we've been talking about a lot about, and my apologies, by the way, I know you're one critical element of this supply chain. I'm asking you about the entire industry from start to finish, but you just mentioned Europe, and we've talked a lot about the U.S. and China here thus far. But to me, in some ways, Europe is interesting on this. Obviously, they have been at the forefront of automotive design and automotive desirability for decades. They are further along in many ways in terms of addressing climate change. They've got a carbon market, all of these things, and yet they don't seem as advanced on this as the U.S. is. In some ways, it's sort of almost surprising that Tesla was started in the United States. It could easily have come up in Europe. Where is Europe on this, on all of this, from your vantage point?
From a critical mineral standpoint, they had a policy earlier than the U.S. and Canada did. The problem in Europe is you're not blessed with the same resources. It's a smaller area that's more densely populated, and you have it was ripe for debate amongst the EU. It would be pretty tough. There's a project in Germany right now that's being developed. There's one in Portugal, Serbia. There's a lot of analysis paralysis. And look, I got a call this morning, an email this morning from someone in Europe. Hey, I love what you're doing over there. They actually look to the U.S. and Canada for potential resources here because look, we have a different history and culture here and are much more resource rich than they are. Europe doesn't want to get stuck in the same problem that they are with natural gas. There's probably there is lithium in Russia. I don't think they want to replicate that again. What they are doing, though, is if there is resources available or if there is opportunities, they are, I think, ahead on grants and also on things like permitting and so forth. They move very, very quickly on that, but they don't have the same recipe that we have over here. We have actually more to offer, and it's a much more compelling, actually, equation, which I think over time, the EU and the US and Canada can actually collaborate quite well on all of this and need to, actually. I mean, the country the continent that's often not talked about, at least in lithium and some of these materials, is Africa. And then there's a lot of investment going on there too, which when you overlay ESG in some of the countries that, in the histories of them and the type of investment and the type of operations that are being set up, they aren't going to meet their criteria in some cases unless the lens has changed. And that's a debate. This is another call for natural resources in Africa. But I think your listeners quite well know the story there, and it's going to repeat for this.
Well, so let me ask one question though on that front, because when you look at the history of 20th century geopolitics, there's quite an overlay with the quest for oil. Yeah. But it occurs to me that actually oil and natural gas are actually relatively well dispersed geographically and geologically around the world. Many of the minerals that you've been talking about today, beyond lithium, you mentioned cobalt and the DRC as an example. But a lot of the metals and minerals needed today are concentrated much more in specific sites than, say, oil and gas are. And given everything we've been talking about today, it seems to me this is something that's maybe a little bit underappreciated in terms of what could happen geopolitically in the world over the rest of this century, as the U.S., as China, and as the European Union and others compete for these for the security of supply. What's your sense of this? And that is it a gold rush effectively that's
Oh
going
yeah.
on, and do you see a real chance for some security problems?
Yeah, you see it now in South America. So, it's in terms of Middle East for minerals resources, South America is very rich, as we all know, gold, silver, nickel. Chile's the largest copper producer, one of the largest in the world, and we are behind there. I mean, that's one area somebody asked where the government might have a blind spot is, from a foreign policy and a engagement standpoint. I would re-engage back with our southern hemisphere neighbors. They would welcome the European and American investment. If you look in Argentina, where I operate another project there, Argentina is a great place to operate, but of course has suffered from high inflation and some economic challenges over the last decades. So if you look at lithium, at least over the last few months, you've seen 3 Chinese companies come in and pay much higher premiums to secure lithium. You're going to see that in nickel. You're going to see that in copper. And it's not only going to be Argentina, it'll be Chile, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador. Because again, those are areas that are very mineral rich, and those countries are looking for direct investment, hard dollars to diversify their economy. And we're a little late to the game on all of that as well. And again, I'm not going to blame China for all the problems, but I mean they look with a much longer view of the world. And again, I think they replicate. Korea and Japan had the same policy. They still do it today. They're the resource poor countries after World War II, and their governments through JOGMEC, KORES, they actively fund. And if you look around the world, you'll see 10% is owned by Mitsubishi. This is owned 5% by POSCO. It's a government policy, and China's does it on a huge scale. We
So
don't.
Orson, yeah, I mean, Orson, clearly we can see in Washington, we've been talking about the bigger concept of energy transition, and clearly there continues to be, political support for the hydrocarbons industry and coal in many ways, but do you sense this urgency on this as John is describing it in Washington? Has it really infused the political thinking there? And it's interesting how much you just talked about Latin America. Latin America has chronically been sort of under. There's been a lack of attention. It's almost been taken for granted that Latin America is in our background, but as opposed to the battlefields of the Middle East and whatnot for oil. But it seems like China is certainly making its way into Latin America, as well as other more allied governments and their development banks and the like. But what's the sense of urgency on this in DC?
Well, I mean, I think two things. One, we had an election in Virginia recently, and the number one issue in that election, gubernatorial election, was kitchen table issues. In particular, the game changer of this discussion, and it really comes down to the game changer of DC, is gas prices. And even though Biden rolled out a great infrastructure bill, Congress passed, his poll numbers still remain the same. And I think that has a lot to do with gas prices being at nearly a 10-year high during the holidays. And if gas prices should continue to rise over the next 3 to 4 weeks into the new year, and if this inflation discussion continues to take root in the talking points of the upcoming midterm election, then the discussion we are having today is a very different discussion 3 or 4 months from now. So, the best way to tell how a president is really doing in DC is sometimes just take a trip to your local gas station and look up and see where the price is, and that'll tell you what the policy and the policy discussions in DC are about. as you probably saw, Biden spent a good I should say, a good segment on his speech, saying that he was going to investigate price gouging and unleash all of the levers of the federal government to address that issue. So I guess what I'm saying is, all politics are local, and the global question, Kevin, is right. But I think people saw what happened in Virginia. They saw what the main issues were, particularly on the economy, and the easiest thing to decipher on all of that was the gas prices were at a record high, and a Democratic president was in office. And I think that will be the discussion when we come back after these holidays on how to address that issue. And that will bleed into, as you have heard from this administration, some of the global discussions on just about everything else, from oil supply to lithium to minerals, et cetera, et cetera.
And just to close the loop on this, on the international front, John, maybe you can dispel or address this sort of myth or thought that had been out there for a long time, because one of the some seminal moments of 2022 or 2021 rather was the botched and chaotic pullout of the United States out of Afghanistan. And there were some in Washington and in other places who suggested that we were leaving behind just a literal, wealth of all of the minerals necessary to enable the energy transition, and that we had effectively just left it to China. Is there anything to that narrative particularly?
Not any data I've ever seen, and I could speak with some authority because when I ran FMC Lithium, we were asked by Department of Defense and the government to look at the geologic data that they had, to include samples that were taken. And like I said, lithium is quite well dispersed, but there's nothing in Afghanistan that we saw that would rival it and make it the largest in the world or anything like that. It would be extremely difficult. The only deposit that I know of that might be worth developing is along the border with Pakistan. There's no roads. It's in the mountains, and it seems like kind of a tough area. There is copper, I believe, and I think there was some discussion about that. But no, I think that, it's funny. There was a news article, I think from 2010 or 11 that was rehashed when we left and when we pulled out of Afghanistan. But no, there's much better deposits in the U.S., in Canada. Australia has them, and it wouldn't be worth the development risk over there as well.
So I want to use the last few minutes that we've got here to kind of return to where I started the entire conversation and go back to COP26 and the environmental concerns that we've got going forward. Now, I know many people who own electric vehicles, and I'll admit I was a convert this past year, gave up the internal combustion engine and became an EV driver. But we have this sort of self-satisfied view that I'm driving around and I'm not emitting any, and there's no emissions. And here in New York City, probably charging it up, there were no really associated emissions. So, but one of the things that has come out, of course, is the overall environmental footprint of any product, which goes all the way back to the mining of the elements that are needed to build the car and so on, and then ultimately the disposal of that car at the end of its life. You've made a really compelling case here, obviously, that actually over time the amount of lithium that's necessary for any battery may go down because of the recycled that some of that may be recyclable, et cetera. But when you look at all of the different metals that are associated with building batteries and the other critical elements of electric vehicles and other other new energy transportation modes and the like, are there real weak spots environmentally in say some of the other metals?
No, I mean copper is widely recycled. When look, when the economy was bad, people were breaking into houses, stealing copper wire. Nickel. I mean, today, if you were to recycle a battery, you'd go after the cobalt and the nickel. Actually, the lithium isn't worth it unless it's a really big battery. And peeling your cell phone battery wouldn't be worth the effort. It would cost more than the metal that you'd extract. But all of those metals can be recycled. And then I think your question's a good one. And look, the math, it depends on lots of things, where you plug in, if it's coal power, whether it's renewables or so forth. But once you get to, I think the last study I saw, the Wall Street Journal did this, 25,000 miles from them onwards, an electric vehicle, all electric vehicle, basically gains on ICE. I mean, the carbon footprint is less. From that point, if you drive the two cars, if you're going to keep going past 25,000 miles, the ICE car is truly much better and overcomes the ICE car. And the last car I traded in was 9 years old. We typically hold on to cars. I think the average age now, because of COVID, is even higher, 11 years. So at the end of that, the whole battery can be recycled, or they can be repurposed for something like your home storage. It depends how much capability is left in, or it can be recycled. And then the car, you think about what's in an electric car, you have one. There's not a whole lot there. You've got some motors, a lot of plastic, which can be recycled. There's a whole lot less parts. There's no motor oil or any of that kind of stuff. So closing the loop on this actually ought to be quite simple. And then as we continue to make changes to our grid and power sources here as well, I mean, the equation continues to get much better. And then how we extract these minerals and so forth. I think it's important that we do it in the U.S. and places like Canada, and that the regulations here, the expectations are higher. And they've continued to get higher. To Orson's point, as we get in discussions, as we've been permitted, we're actually going above and beyond. You have to. Part of it is we're the first, so you have to set the right example. I mean, somebody's failure in the industry is a failure for me. We're all in this together. I consider speaking for the whole industry here, and companies are willing to go above and beyond, not only on the environmental standpoint, but also on the social standpoint as well. And that's where these resources are in very disadvantaged communities. So job training, providing jobs, investment in communities, whether that's daycare center, school, whatever. Those all, you have to ensure that the benefits flow back to the communities, and that at the end of the day, you're creating generational jobs here that people will. It's no different than the inner city, some of the neighborhoods that we're in where there are no opportunities. And that has to come with all this as well. It's the whole package.
And my final question on that, on the technology front, is, as you have your discussions with and work with ultimately the battery manufacturers and the like, you've talked about Panasonic building in Nevada and whatnot. How is the technology of the batteries themselves, evolving here? In other words, is the call on lithium, irrespective of whether it's freshly mined or recycled ultimately, but is the call on lithium basically constant, or is that something that can be even made more efficient and get more battery distance, or however you measure that over time? Is that something that will require less of various metals and minerals to produce the same output of battery?
So yes and yes. I mean, lithium, I said, is the underlying thing of all, but you can actually get batteries with more energy density. So effectively, you're going to need less, right, to put in your car or your phone or whatever else. And that's the move to things like silicon anodes and solid state batteries with lithium anodes. All those things are basically being worked on now. And some of these things are tested, like if you wear a fitness band, a Whoop, a lot of people wear those. That's the technology for that. The reason why the battery is much better on this version than the last one is because Sila, which is a California Silicon Valley-based company, it's their own anode. So you test it on handhelds and things like that, but you put that into a car, you could see 20 to 30% more energy density, so more longer range. I mean, the ultimate in this country is, or any market is, you want to drive, what's a good gas car, 400 miles, 450 miles. And then the other key piece of this is I can plug in and I can charge quick. So if you look, I'm a huge Big Ten fan, as you guys both know. So Purdue is working with Ford now, where they've come up with a special cable that has much higher amperage. It's a cool cable where you can charge your car, I think it's less than 15 minutes. Those types of innovations are all happening. All these different problems or barriers to for entry are all being addressed and worked on. I mean, it's like the semiconductor industry. Moore's law. You keep getting better and better and better. And industry is pushing this. It's just the interesting point. This isn't the Manhattan Project where the government is funding all of it. It's already happening.
Yeah, and this is where the infrastructure element is so critical. I mean, as a Tesla owner, that ability to use the supercharging station, between points A and B is the differentiator at the moment in so many ways. Well, I just want to say thank you very much, because I think that what this call has demonstrated yet again is how much education is necessary. I mean, I've learned a lot on this call. I know I don't know as much as many people on this subject, but I know more than most. And I already have an understanding deficit. And Orson demonstrated yet again in his descriptions of what's going on in Washington that we're not all completely on the same page, but the ingredients are there. It's important environmentally, but also competitively, and for our own economy. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for your time today. Jonathan Evans and Orson Porter, we've learned a lot. Good luck with your projects and permitting in Nevada and in Argentina. I know there's a lot going on this front. We look forward to seeing the progress next year. To everybody else, I want to thank you for joining today. Our next call will be on Thursday, December the 2nd. It will be my team in Teneo's political risk advisory business, our group of analysts, and our annual look ahead at 2022 and what to expect in major markets around the world. So until then, happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Enjoy some time off. Thank you for joining today. Thank you to Jonathan. Thank you to Orson. Have a great day. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York.